I know we've taken up your time, and I just had two last quick questions that I couldn't help to notice. One being, you with The Genius in All of Us and your last book about chess, and before that, Alzheimer's, obviously talking about the brain and kind of the way it functions. Then I looked further in your past, and I believe your first book was about being a deadhead.
My first book was about the Grateful Dead. Yep.
I have to hear how that evolved.
Well, I imagine you're a three-dimensional person with a lot of different interests, and I imagine both you guys are, since you're two people. I guess that's 6 dimensions or something.
It's a lot of dimensions.
And that's just what I am too. I mean, I'm just a person, and a lot of people do. A lot of people in their writing careers do kind of fall into one track, and they become, an environmental writer or a education writer or whatever. And the goal in my goal as a writer has always been not to let that happen, to just follow my own curiosities. And it's in a way, it's a little bit of a more difficult challenge because, it's easy for an audience to kind of identify you as a certain kind of writer and just to kind of read book after book. And that's an easier kind of path to follow. But the only way that I've just ever known is just kind of, being passionate enough about various things and following those passions and those curiosities. And I've been lucky enough to write books that are all pretty different from one another, pretty different subjects. I think there are connections from one to another, but it's certainly not an easy formula. And I think that may seem weird to you and may seem weird to other people, but I think it's also very natural. There are a lot of artists that kind of pursue their careers that way. My next book, I can't really talk about it, but I can tell you it's going to be wildly different from this last book. I'm not writing like, The Genius in All of Us 2 now. I wrote, after I wrote The Forgetting about Alzheimer's disease, it did very well. I was really proud of that. But, I didn't then go on to people were like, oh, you should write the Parkinson's book now.
Right.
That would have been fine if I was fascinated with Parkinson's disease. There's nothing that's not interesting about that disease. It just wasn't the thing that was lighting my fire then. So I moved on to something else, and that's part of the thrill of my job. I'm really lucky to be able to do what I do.
Sure. No. And I love that because we get to read then different aspects, through the same writing style. And then the last thing very quickly is just data smog. I found that really interesting because you wrote it in 1997 and it's continually been more prevalent. I mean, most things written in 97, 15 years ago are going to fall off. But I wanted to see if you could go back and write that book now, how much would it change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually did that thought experiment about 5 years ago. I wrote a piece for Slate that was kind of data smog 10 years later, and I reread the book, and I pointed out, I hope in a fairly objective way, although obviously I'm ultimately the furthest thing from objective. But I kind of went through it and I said, oh, I got that right. That was ridiculously off, So I tried to point out a bunch of my mistakes and also some things that I thought, I'm pretty proud that that were still very much true, and perhaps, as you say, truer than ever. At the time that I was writing Data Smog, it's the kind of subject that and I certainly wasn't the first person to have the concept of information overload. So, all a writer does is kind of bring other ideas together from other people and put their own stamp on them. But at the time that I was writing it, it was also fairly obvious that this was, and I wrote that into the book, is that we're now embarking on an age. This has been emerging for the last really 30 or 40 years, this kind of information age. But now it's really here, and it's obviously going to accelerate. There's of course nothing that's going to stop that acceleration. And so I was very conscious of writing about trends that I thought, for better and worse, were gonna increase. I think the fundamentals are actually still there, and that's as I said, I think that's a good thing and a bad thing. I think we're here, we're flooded with information that's never going to change. It's always going to be now a part of the human condition to, instead of having this desperately hard time of finding information, it's really going to be more a matter of getting lots and lots of it for very, 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 very small amounts of money and time, and having the skills, hopefully, to sift through it and to make meaning out of it. And that's just a very different challenge from what humans have faced for most of humanity. But I think we're we're kind of getting used to it now, and that's the world that we live in, that our kids are growing up in.